So we've had a conversation already about contingency leadership theory and the way that that shows up in companies and for-profit entities. And I'm excited to have a conversation about how that shows up in churches and in nonprofit spaces as well. I think for me, one of the things that I've noticed in churches in particular is that I don't hear a lot of conversation about contingencies. What do we do when things don't go to plan? I think sometimes we expect, we've been doing this for years, and, as long as we have enough meetings and as long as we have the right people in the room, everything is going to go fine. And we don't really create a lot of space for that. So for example, I primarily lead worship. And so, I recognize technology, right? Our technology works great until we need it to. It seems like there's always about 15 to 20 minutes before the service where something technological doesn't go well. Our microphones, for some reason, start cutting out. Our live stream, for some reason, isn't really working. And there's few examples for me where I see folks having a really deep discussion about contingencies for when these things sort of happen. What I tend to experience is this panic, right? This panic over this isn't working, and then trying to communicate without communicating, right? Because you're in the middle of a service. You don't want your congregation to know that something is going wrong. And so you're trying to, so-and-so's mic isn't working. And I'm really just hoping that they will switch to another microphone without us having a conversation beforehand to say, if your microphone doesn't work, here are some alternatives, And, it's one of those things where I feel like we've been in ministry for so long, and I'm not sure. Is it that we've done it for so long that we just think that we've got it, or is it that we feel like we're doing something altruistic? We feel like we're doing something very spiritual, and so we shouldn't be so rigid about. We should kind of just follow our formats and see how things work out, and just trust that everything will work out. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I think that's really so interesting with contingent theory, because what occurred to me, interestingly, Jesse, is probably because I am not on that side of it.
Mm.
I think is pretty fantastic when things go wrong, right? When you have to tell the multimedia thing, this is what's going to happen. When you say, "Hey, we lost a main singer, so we're going to sing this today." I think part of it, if you develop a leadership contingency where you're flexible and you do it in a God is giving you an opportunity today to deal with challenges, it comes across a lot different. And I know a lot of pastors. I love pastors. I've coached 100 pastors, and they're wonderful people. And they do like a little bit of control. And we talked last time about the fact that people with control have pretty big challenge with contingency leadership theory, right?
Yeah.
I think that's pretty interesting, and obviously the early disciples dealt with contingency. I remember somewhere, you'll know the scripture, and I'm not a big scripture person, but there was something about dusting your dust off your shoes and moving on, right?
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
contingency. They didn't go into that area not thinking. They knew God's there, but people weren't ready for him, right? So they moved
Absolutely.
on. And I think in a lot of ways, if I was to talk to churches and pastors and leaders, you don't have to be perfect, right? And maybe the way contingency theory might be applied inside churches is celebrate when things go wrong, right? Work
Mm.
hard to make sure they don't, but celebrate when things go wrong. That we're able to involve more people. We're able
Mm-hmm.
to disconnect. Now, as I say that, though, all my pastor friends are going nuts, right? Because they're thinking, well, we get all these people come voluntarily, right?
Mm-hmm.
they expect us to have our act together, right? There's nothing
Mm,
worse than a pastor that doesn't have a message that's, he's basically received from God and as worked on, right? None of
mm-hmm.
us want a poor sermon, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's a lot of reasons to be in control, but I do think contingency theory would argue that as a leader, as a pastor, you should figure ways to find that second and third person we talked about last time to basically, at least chuckle about it,
Mm-hmm.
that things, and talk about it and be a
Yeah.
little more intentional. Is the spirit moving, right? Or are we trying to control the spirit? I see that a lot too. And that might be way too much criticism. I don't maybe you've never seen it, but it feels sometimes that our pastors and our leaders of our church want to control the spirit rather than the spirit control the church.
I totally agree. I couldn't agree more. I think, you kind of mentioned how we feel like the some pastors might not receive that well. And you mentioned too how you receive it as someone in the congregation. I wonder if we think enough about how our congregation receives things. So, for example, true, if I get up to preach a message that's very confusing, seems like I'm very scattered, I do agree that our congregation would take that, would probably see that as me not being prepared or responsible enough to focus a little deeper on my message, right? But at the same time, if I am if I've written out a script and I'm standing there reading it word for word and everybody can tell that I'm reading it word for word, then they're like, okay, maybe we over prepared here. Maybe we're too focused on things. And then also, how are, do our congregations hold every part of the service, every aspect of the service with the same weight? They might be much more critical about the way that the sermon comes off, but are they really that critical about the fact that, the slides didn't work the way that we planned? Or, a microphone cut out? Are they a lot more forgiving than we think they are? I know, like, for example, for our online folks, if a microphone cuts out, that's a much bigger deal than for our folks in the room. Because clarity is important. We don't want folks struggling to hear. But sometimes it's not so much, we get very worked up about the EQ levels. Sometimes people are okay just with clarity. Doesn't have to sound perfect, but as long as it's clear, we're okay with that. So yeah, I think, sometimes I've been I've led worship once where we started the song and we started the song all wrong. And I just had to say, all right, hold on. Let's stop. Okay. That didn't go as planned. Let's start again from the top. We started again from the top and it went perfectly. And if that's not happening every Sunday, that I think at least your consistent members will give you a little bit of grace in that moment. Sometimes, like you said, you have to be relying on the spirit. Sometimes some things in the service just have to go. And I wonder, do we have proper ways of communicating that to everyone? Hey, I feel like the spirit is leading me in another direction. I just need to communicate to my team really quickly that that's happening, and so that everyone can adjust to that. So yeah, I wonder about all those types of things. And I will say too, I serve in what I would call two different models of church. I serve in the existing church, which I would call, your buildings, your churches that have your traditional service times, very traditional, like, small group structures. And I also serve in fresh expressions spaces, fresh expressions being churches that are much more grassroots in a way, that kind of are built around different contexts, a way of inviting folks into church in a way that they can connect to better, not the existing model of church. And I will say that you see a lot more things not going to plan in Fresh Expressions, and it doesn't affect participation, in my opinion, at all, because I think the expectations are so different than they are in a existing church model where you show up at a certain time, your service has to last a certain amount of time. These are the expected expected rhythms of the service or the small group, and these are the types of things that people are looking for. So yeah, it's a lot of different strokes, I think, for different folks.
I think I love that. I think one of the areas that's really pretty interesting to me, last time we talked about, and you seem to get some energy around it. You have a leader, I use myself, and I basically hired two other people that were different personalities, different styles that made me more complete and more acceptable. Part of the challenge in my mind is that pastors are a little bit on an island, right?
Mm,
They may hire a little bit of a staff. They're usually for their expertise in their area, right? It's not necessarily a really high paying job. They're there because God's given them a passion, which is great. The challenge is that leaves the pastor with a lot of different roles in the church, right? They
hmm
are the person that, basically helps people during crisis. They're the people that write the sermons. They're the people that develop strategies. They're seen as the leader of the church, right? The face of the church. They have to be all these different things, right? They have to have the right kind of presentation to people old like myself, and they have to be able to relate to people young like you. It's extremely challenging, and they're not. They have to work with volunteers, right? And
hmm
they have to work with people that are there if they want to be, and they don't have to come back next Sunday. I mean, they have not bought into a contract, right? They're
hmm
less reliable as returning church members than your grass cutter, which at least you signed for 6 months and they're going to show up, right?
Yeah.
These people don't have to show up the next week. I think it puts a lot of pressure on pastors. They're called, they're a very diverse group. They're there for a number of reasons, number of years. They brought up in different traditions. There's a lot of traditions within the church, right? Both collectively, but also individual churches, right? Do they have a graveyard? Do they, are they older? Are they younger? Do they invite fresh expressions? Do they not? It makes for a really challenging point to be flexible, right? Because
hmm
you have to embrace some vulnerability. You have to embrace and actively listening to who your congregation is. And that
hmm
can be stressful for pastors, right? Who want
Absolutely.
to have to maintain their persona of authority, if you will, or competency at the very least, right?
hmm
So it's a very challenging position for sure.
And I would say one thing that would add to that challenge is, the person that you're following. So, in my experience in the United Methodist Church, we have a system where pastors move from church to church every 4 or so years. If you're following a pastor who was well beloved, who was a really great fit for that community, it can be really, really challenging when you come in with a different leadership style, a different communication style, and, you know, it's not necessarily that you are not a good pastor, but it can come across that way in some of the ways that folks will respond. So, sometimes when you get a really good pastor, if people make up their minds before the new pastor even arrives that they're going to leave and they're going to follow this other pastor. So I don't know, depending on how uh, how well accepted the previous pastor was, you could lose 20, 30 people who were regular attenders, people who were regular givers. You could lose those folks depending on where that previous pastor went as well and how far people are willing to travel. And so I think contingency leadership theory, I think, helps not just the leaders, the clergy leaders, but I think it can also help some of the congregational leaders as well to be willing to adapt to their new pastor and the gifts of their new pastor and the shortcomings of their new pastor, and trying to adapt to those things as well. So I think that'd be really, really helpful. Again, I think it's different from a Fresh Expressions point of view. I think it's also different from a nonprofit point of view, because leaders also transition, I think, too, in nonprofits, not as often, but that's also a dynamic as well. And circumstances change around nonprofits. For example, I was on the phone with my aunt, who is working on a nonprofit that's adjacent to her church, but not exactly. She was talking about a lot of the governmental changes and where resources used to come from, and that they don't come from there anymore, and things of that nature. So I think this is a leadership theory that can help in all of those different dynamics as well.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time talking about transition, and I guess it raised a issue I'd love to talk to you about. We have developed, leadership people have developed in the past transition kinds of workshops or information to help guide the changes, right? So
Hmm.
if you wanted to instill this idea of contingency leadership, right, particularly when you're being transferred from one congregation to another, some of the characteristics that we pointed out in the article we wrote was you have to be able to relinquish some control,
Hmm.
embrace vulnerability, and actively listen to the diverse needs of the congregation, right?
Hmm.
So my question isn't so much, and I think most pastors would be nodding their head if they were listening to our podcast right now. Yeah, it'd be nice to know. How do you think um, the conference or the organization should, what kind of skills should they give people during that transition period? What kind of training, what kind of orientation? Like I am the wild and crazy guy, throw out everything, and you are the a person that wants structure, right?
Hmm.
If we added our two wives, as we discovered last weekend, we were talking about this. We'd have two more type of models. How do you how do you provide some skill sets in things like this contingency leadership to new pastors?
I would say the very first thing that this model would require is effective listening, because I think you have to really understand the unique situation that you're in and what makes this new community unique. I think a lot of listening, and I'm a much more structured person, so for me, the more listening, the better. Some of the recommendations that I've heard is that you don't change anything after the first year. Well, I started at the church that I'm currently in now, and we changed things within the first 3 months. That's not the recommendation. That's not the standard operating practice, but based on the context that I was in, that's what was necessary. And so a lot of listening is required. I think even a lot more listening is required when when you are when you're put in a position where you feel like you do have to change things a little bit earlier than you had planned. So listening, I think, is a really, really big one. I think, as always, understanding yourself and understanding how you respond to different things, I think, is really, really important too. You have to really understand your style and be able to communicate your style as well. You have to, especially in those first few months, you have to be willing to take criticism and understand that change is difficult for folks. And change introduces a lot of doubts. A lot of folks like myself, we like things to be very structured. We like our routines to stay the way that they are. And sometimes folks are pushing back just because their routines are being changed. Their expectations are being changed, not because your idea was wrong, not because you're not following the spirit, but just because we don't always like change. We don't always like our expectations subverted. And so I think you have to be willing to give yourself grace and give grace to folks who might respond in ways that are not the kindest, but also just kind of recognize that for a lot of folks, they have poured a lot of time, a lot of effort. They've built a lot of relationships around their church. And so they have a lot of ownership over it. And when you come in and you see things that need to be changed or things at least need to adapt to your new leadership style, folks are not always going to take that well. So yeah, I think being sure that you understand your style and you can communicate your style really, really well. I think establishing really good modes of communication in general. I think one of the things that I've heard as a consistent theme between our last conversation and this conversation is how important communication is and knowing who to communicate to and when. And because sometimes, especially in a crisis situation, you don't have a lot of time to communicate, right? So I think communication is always, always, always really, really important. But listening as a part of that communication, listening and being able to properly understand the unique situation that you're in, I think those are some of the key things when you're first entering into a new community. That's really, really important.
I don't know if you have other examples that, and I would really appreciate them, but I'm looking at our screen and I have this old guy who's a bit mid baby boomer over on this side, and I have a young millennial on the other side, right? And we come from different generations, different backgrounds. Yet we've managed, at least from my point of view, we've managed to communicate, learn to listen to each other, learn to bridge some of the obvious gaps, which led us really to do this together, right? In large part because we're so different. I'm wondering if using us as an example and then expanding into some other people that you would normally not have connected with, we can kind of try to explore what are some of the key things that make communication possible. What are some of the things that make respect possible when there's obvious differences, right? A young pastor with an older church, et cetera, et cetera. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things is I think it takes time, right? Obviously, but I think also just kind of trying to understand where, like, what context folks are coming from. So, for example, I am I'm not I try to be on time, right? I try to be on time as best as I can, but I also have this tendency to try to get one more thing done before I leave the house. And I don't take I don't take traffic into consideration all the time, right? And my father-in-law, for example, he sees folks being late as a sign of disrespect for the person's time. I don't see things that way. I see folks being late as a fact of life. There's a lot of things happening in life, a lot of things that you can't control. There are things that you can control, but even in our humanness, we can't control everything, right? We can't even control ourselves all the time. So I see that as just a fact of life, that we have a lot of really well-meaning people that try as they might, they can't be on time all the time. But I have to be really conscious of the fact that there are folks who see that as a big sign of disrespect. And when I am working with those folks, I got to add 30, maybe even an hour of extra time to get there early. And I'll make a deal with myself that I'll get there early and I'll bring some stuff to work on so that I don't feel like I'm getting there so early that I'm wasting my own time. Because I recognize that that's important to them. Whether or not I think that's right or wrong, I think I have to put that aside. For our relationship to work, I have to know what things are non-negotiables in our relationship and what things are negotiable, and I have to be willing to adjust the way that I think to kind of meet halfway, because I think fundamentally we're all human, and fundamentally we all want the same things, but I think the expressions of that can be really different. Because, like you said, you and I have that difference in generations. You are mid baby boomer. I am young millennial. Now we've got in the workforce Gen Z who are now coming up, and they have a totally different way of viewing the world as well. And I spend some time on social media, and I see ways that folks are highlighting those differences and making light and making fun of it. But and I think that's all good. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But at the same time, recognizing that as more and more folks in Gen Z enter into the workforce, and then even Gen Alpha, I think, which is coming next, there's more opportunity for that, to understand where it is that they're coming from. These are kids that grew up going to school, and some of them during a pandemic, and missing graduations, and the world changing post pandemic, and doing certain things online. They were growing up in like the Me Too era and things like that. And so, kind of taking those things into consideration and being willing to be flexible, understanding where you're coming from, not adapting it or adopting where you're coming from, but being willing to adjust when I know I'm meeting with someone who has these beliefs that they live by. I think I'm wondering too, like, how does contingency leadership look like in ministry when you're not the senior leader, right? For example, if you're like in the situation where I'm in, where I'm the associate pastor, and my senior pastor has his way of doing leadership, but like I said already, I've spent a lot more time in fresh expression spaces. So how does someone like me, who has had much more opportunity to work in much more flex spaces, how do I not come across as disrespectful to the established traditional church with of some of my ways of doing ministry? How do I toe that line between wanting to be contingent but not wanting to come off as inconsistent, unreliable in that ministry space?
Yeah, I think that is challenging in the for-profit area and extremely challenging in the nonprofit church area, particularly the church area. There's a hierarchy in pastors, right? Also, your directors of music and ministry and disciple making and those type of people there because of a passion and they're all voluntary. They may see things different. It's a lot more challenging, I think, to want to be yourself, but you feel like you need to comply with certain structures, right, and personality types. So that's interesting. I have to say, from my point of view, I never really liked having a boss. I mean, that's
Mm,
just my nature. You can imagine it as you start to think about my personality. I just want to get things done. Well, bosses, you have to explain what you're doing. I would just rather just do it, right?
yeah.
But what I learned is sometimes bosses don't like that. Who would have
That's true.
guessed, right? But the So the interesting thing, and I'll offer this to you and see what you think about it, is if you have to give a face to the boss, right, the senior pastor, which they deserve, right? They deserve to have their area respected. I would do that in areas that I needed to, right? In my case, reporting results. In your case, basically conforming with music, perhaps, or whatever that you're responsible for. I would spend the majority of my time, this is just me talking, I would spend the majority of my time in my passion with people that I work with and people that work for me. So I would pour my heart, my data, my innovation, all those things you just talked about into other people.
Mm.
And I would encourage them and I get involved. And that's where I would get my energy. I don't know if that's I don't know where to classify that, but I would say that if you have things that God's given you that need to come out and you don't have a leader that sees those, you need to find an alternative place to do them, if that
Mm.
makes sense. And whether it's fresh expressions or ministry or writing or potentially a leadership podcast, what the heck, you know? That could be another one. I just think you have to figure a way to let your passion out. Now, I would say that during the times, depending on the leadership structure and what's expected, I would also identify small things I wanted to do more of just to test the waters
Mm.
with my boss. I'm speaking strictly from my point of view, but because I don't know where you're thinking about it, but I do think your passion has to come out. You have to be your real self, if that
Hmm.
makes sense. And
Yeah.
I've coached so many pastors that are in a situation where they feel like they can't be their real self, and that's really challenging. And um, it creates pretty significant problems. Now, I would say this, I mean, I think the district superintendents and the leadership beyond that, they seem to want to, and I've always been supportive of the ones I know, of trying to find that place or that way, but it's challenging, and I think, it's particularly challenging if you're doing something like contingency leadership, which by its nature is out of the box.
Hmm.
It's out of the norm. It's out of what your leadership has done, right?
Hmm.
And, I think there are a lot of cases that way, but I would find a place for it. Does
Yeah.
that make sense? Or
Well, that makes total sense. Yeah, I think I like the way you framed it in terms of your energy, right? Like where are you getting energy? I think that's so important because you don't want to burn out trying to adapt to someone else's leadership style and following someone else's way of leading. You do, but and you also want to be able to maintain that respect. And I think a really core way of doing that is having a space where you know that you can be yourself. Knowing that you can be yourself in this space, I think will allow you the opportunities to I don't want to say fall in line, but be more respectful. I think in other spaces because, like you said, those folks have earned that spot. And I think we need to be respectful in that space. And I think that it's kind of led me to a question that I've had around all of contingency theory is like, what are the dangers of a fixed leadership identity when you're considering all these other moving parts? Like, for example, like I'm just a relational leader, or I'm just a decisive leader, or I'm just a behavioral kind of leader or something like that. What what are the how flexible should we be in terms of who we are? Because like you said, you don't want to change who you are, but it seems like this leadership theory is saying that there should be some wiggle room in our leadership style.
and I think we've talked about it before. If not, we are certainly going to just self-evaluations, right? Like Myers-Briggs and Strength Finders, which is one of my personal favorites. That really develops who you are. Coaching is a way of looking at it too, mentoring, identifying who you are and what's the best aspects of it. I think that's going to be really the key as we continue to talk about these. They're going to blend together in a sense, right?
Mm,
Where it's not as if you can just pick one off and say, "Wow, that works every time," or
yeah.
"Yeah, that really is fantastic." And a lot of these were created in the 50s, 60s. I mean, they were created where leadership was very dynamic and starting to form. There was a lot of opportunities with technology to become a broader leader, those types of things. So, people that were great thinkers created these models. And certainly, I think there's models that are more useful than others
Mm,
myself. But I would say that I agree. It's a learning process. I mean, that's where we came up with our basic that we just don't want to talk about theory. We want to talk about whether it's useful or not, right? And what the challenges of it were. I would agree with that. I wonder too, as you were talking, not only about the theory and whether it's applicable, but I think in places like churches, it's really important for the pastor, the minister of music, the staff, the leaders of to have someone else to be able to talk to
mm,
because even if you're a great listener and you're a fantastic person, and certainly you and I know many fantastic people that we would hold up as wonderful leaders, you still need somebody as a leader to be there alongside of you, either
mhm,
behind you or alongside of you, or maybe even walking ahead of you.
mhm,
So I think one of the things that happens a lot of time in the health of the church is the pastor feels like they're on an island. She's
yeah.
basically sitting there by herself, sometimes with a congregation that doesn't really relate to her for whatever reason, or
Mhm,
him for whatever reason. And one of the biggest aspects of these leadership theories, I think, is giving some structure to a connection. And
mm,
at the end of that connection, though, needs to be either a person or maybe someday AI buddy, I don't know, but you can't feel alone, if that makes
yeah.
sense. Because the
Oh, that
more
makes
you're isolated, I think more of these theories feel like a life jacket, and I'm just gonna grab onto them, right?
mhm,
And the world then disappoints you because there's always aspects of it that the theory doesn't work for.
mhm, yeah. Yeah, and I think you always need someone who you can speak openly, with about because sometimes, like I said earlier, sometimes, especially when you're in ministry, clergy can feel like folks see them as the main problem in their church. And sometimes it's got very little to do with you and just a lot to do with the fact that change is happening. And I think, if it's taken me this long to hear about this contingency leadership and the fact that, it's so important for us to be flexible and for us to adapt to all these different moving parts, I can only imagine how some folks in our congregations will also feel and will want so much to hold on to the past and think that, when we had a previous pastor, things were better, and so all we need to do is change the pastor, you know? It can be very difficult for clergy to kind of hold on to that type of appointment if they don't have folks to speak to on the outside of that. I think I'm grateful for being a part of a conference in a church Episcopal structure where there are folks whose full-time job is to find resources for me to be able to be the best version of myself. I'm very grateful to be a part of teams that have worked on those types of things because I know that there are a lot of clergy out there who feel that they're alone. And it's not always based on your Episcopal structure. I think some of it is the work that you do. I mean, I know that there are a lot of folks in our structure who choose not to who choose not to utilize those resources or utilize those cohorts. And if you're one of those people, I would encourage you to find your people. Doesn't necessarily have to come from the conference, but you definitely need to find your people that you can lean on for sure. Thanks for joining the Theory to Thriving podcast. If you made it this far in the video, continue the conversation with us. You can join our free to join Discord, or you can just leave us a comment. We'll see you soon.